there are only 4 recognized religions in Eritrea. And if you deviate from those religions, even if it's something as simple as holding a prayer ceremony inside your house, then you can be put in prison. And I started to wonder what it was like in there. And some of the answers I got were so horrifying and heartbreaking and also humbling, because one of the things that came back again and again in people's accounts was how, despite the most dehumanizing of conditions, prisoners would pull the tiny little things that they had and try to help each other stay alive.
How can I help? How can I be useful in ending needless suffering? Do not be afraid of work that has no end.
We have to organize a social movement.
We have an opportunity to lead by example versus just talking, hot air.
I think the more people in this fight, the more we grow. Eventually it could change. The people are the ones that can make the change.
Welcome back to Change Agents, an Ironclad original presented by Montana Knife Company. My guest today is Katharine Houreld. Today's episode is about the humanitarian crisis in Eritrea, a country that has the second most slaves in the world, second only to North Korea of all things. We're going to be talking about the country in general. We're going to be talking about the daily horrors that detainees experience in Eritrean prisons. And we're going to be doing all of that with award-winning journalist Katharine Houreld. Katharine is an investigative journalist. Currently, she is the Washington Post East Africa Bureau Chief and previously served as the East Africa Bureau Chief for Reuters, based in Nairobi. She is also the writer behind a stunning recent report entitled "An African Gulag So Ghastly That Inmates Risk Death to Escape." Let's dive in. Enlighten not only myself, but the people listening and watching. Can you tell a little bit of the history of the country itself, where it came from, and along the way, the king that's been in power for, or not king, but president, even though I suspect he may think of himself as a king, the one who's been holding the reins for 30 years?
Sure. So Eritrea used to be part of Ethiopia. It fought a long and extremely bloody war for independence. And it gained its independence after, these years of fighting in which you had, which relied on sort of highly disciplined fighters, fighting in trenches against a very militarily superior enemy. And they were very well organized. They used to have classes in the trenches. They had highly trained medics. It was very much a sort of socialist society where everybody was pulling together for the greater good. After independence, they did not have any elections. They've never had a constitution. The court system doesn't really function if you're arrested for anything that might be even vaguely political, which includes an attempt to leave the country. So many people now call Eritrea the North Korea of Africa, because it is so repressive against anybody questioning its government or its president.
Where did the president, whose name I'm not even going to attempt because I know that I'm going to get it incorrectly, what is his origin story? How is he able to come to power and hold it for 30 years?
Well, Isaias Afwerki is, a former independence fighter, like most of the senior people in his government. If you're a veteran of the struggle, it gives you a certain kind of brotherhood or sisterhood, because they had many women fighting on the front lines as well. And those independence fighters have never really given up their hold on power. to this day. So it was a society, it was a nation born out of mass militarization, and it's never really demilitarized. It's still mandatory to go either into the military or do national service. In theory, when you're 18, often they take children, 15. I've certainly interviewed people that had that experience. And the problem is that military experience, that military conscription, can last for decades. You might only receive a couple of dollars a month. Sexual abuse is rife. Suicides are extremely common. You have people who have children that they haven't seen for a decade or something like this because they can't get leave to go home. So it's a really highly controlled system. And that's why so many people want to escape from that country.
Yeah, I'm looking at some stats in front of me. Nearly 9% of the country's population is enslaved, so 320,000 people. Is that synonymous with their doing their mandatory service? And I'm using air quotes because it certainly seems like their initial mandatory service might go far longer than initially agreed to. And prison, or when you look at this number, is this just in their mandatory service?
That would be the mandatory service.
Okay.
So you could also be potentially put as a maybe a teacher or a civil servant of some. But most people do go into the military. If you don't graduate from high school, you go automatically into the military. And these are the conscripts that were being sent to fight in Tigray as well. So, you had a lot of newly conscripted, frightened people being put on the front line. And you also had a lot of killings of civilians. And
we were talking about earlier, like the human rights violations that were going on kind of got your attention in that area. What drew your attention even deeper into the country, into their prison system?
I interviewed so many Eritrean refugees during the war in Ethiopia. I got to know some of them fairly well. Most of them had served time in prison. One person who I used as a translator and who became a dear friend had served 7 years in prison. His father had died in prison. His mother had lost her mind in prison. They had been imprisoned because they were suspected of being Jehovah's Witnesses. There are only 4 recognized religions in Eritrea. And if you deviate from those religions, even if it's something as simple as holding a prayer ceremony inside your house, then you can be put in prison. And I started to wonder what it was like in there. And some of the answers I got were so horrifying and heartbreaking and also humbling, because one of the things that came back again and again in people's accounts was how, despite the most dehumanizing of conditions, prisoners would pull the tiny little things that they had and try to help each other stay alive. And I found that with different translators looking at different prisons, the sharing of a pair of shoes, somebody got a food parcel from home, any tiny little thing that came in was divided and shared, and people did their very best to be disciplined about things like sleeping in shifts because there wasn't enough room on the floor for everybody to lie down. So you would have to you couldn't put your back down. You'd have to sleep on your side, pressed up against somebody with your chest and your back, and while other people stood. But because if you lost that discipline, so many people could die. It leads to a lot of kindness and a lot of the sublimation of the self for the group. And I was really interested in that, and I was really interested in how extreme experiences produced this human kindness, basically.
I can understand why people would call Eritrea the North Korea of Africa when you're talking about even just practicing a religious belief inside of your own house could net you in prison. What is their judicial or legal system like? Let's say somebody in some way reports that their neighbor is having a religious get-together of some kind. Is there even a court system, or are they dragged off? I mean, are they going before a judge? Are they getting a sentence? Or are some of these people, if not the majority, being just taken to prison with an unknown idea of how long they are going to be there?
So most of the people that I interviewed 42 people, none of them had been to court. From what I understand, if you are accused of a crime such as theft, possibly rape or murder, depending on the circumstances, you might go to court. But you, if you are arrested for criticizing the government, anything religious, that might go on the basis of, if you're arrested for anything religious that the government doesn't sanction, if you try to leave the country without permission, then you will also be arrested. So none of those people had gone to court. The one guy spoke of one of his cellmates who had tried to leave the country when he was 16 with a group of 10 people, and he met him in an underground prison when the guy had already been in there for 7 years. Imagine putting a 16-year-old in prison underground for 7 years because he wanted to leave the country.
I mean, honestly, I would like to believe I have a pretty wild imagination, but that one exceeds kind of the limits of depravity, of how a human being could treat other human beings. And so when they're put into these prisons and the people that you talk to, was there a sentence associated with that, or they were just going to get out when they got out, when somebody decided to open the door and let them go?
There was no sentence. It seemed to them to be very haphazard. I interviewed one guy who's now a nurse in LA, who was in prison for 5 years. He did not know why he was arrested. And one day somebody came along and saw him in prison and said, "Oh, are you still here?" and let him out. That was it. They came for him at the hospital that he worked at one day, and took him to prison. And he is now attending a lot of demonstrations against the government in America because of the memory of all those people that he left behind in those prisons. He spoke about one woman, Esther Solomon, who was the wife of a former minister, who was also imprisoned when he called for democratic reforms. After he was arrested, she flew back from the States where she'd been studying because they had young children. And she was arrested at the airport. That was about 20 years ago. She was kept in a cell by herself. And he said once she managed to hear her daughter's voice on the radio talking about her. The family had managed to escape the United States. And he said she used to cry every night. She'd been there for 20 years. She hadn't seen her children since they were toddlers. So and she has no sentence. Nobody knows how long she'll be there for, if she'll die there. There's a 15-year-old girl who's an American citizen, the daughter of another minister who fled the country, who's minister of information. She was 15 when she was taken. She's 25 now. Now be sure to get paper all that time. But I do understand that she's still alive. And she was arrested immediately after her father fled the country.
Do you have any estimate? I mean, you said you talked to 42 people who had spent time in those prisons. Do you have an estimate of, I guess it would be a two-part question. One would be how many prisons there are, whether overt or covert, and two would be the number of people currently imprisoned.
So I don't have either of those figures. I think anybody who would have those figures would be in the Eritrean government. It's very difficult to track the number of prisons because so many things are used as prisons. There are formal prisons, there's underground prisons, there's shipping containers used as prisons. One prisoner spoke of tunnels being dug into a cliff face and people being put in there. The number of prisoners is constantly changing. So, in terms of the number of prisons, I don't know. I just know that the prisons are full to bursting. Many people spoke about this desperate overcrowding and the terrible conditions that they faced as a result of that. So, no idea, to be honest.
Ladies and gentlemen, I could not be more fired up to introduce the presenting sponsor for Season 2 of Change Agents, Montana Knife Company. Founded by somebody that I feel very fortunate to call a personal friend, Master Bladesmith Josh Smith. Not only a Master Bladesmith, but the youngest Master Bladesmith and one of the most experienced in the world. Montana Knife Company blades are some of the finest that I've ever been able to get my hands on. They are the sharpest knife out of the box, and they're some of the easiest to resharpen when you dull the blade. I take them everywhere that I go. I have them in every vehicle that I own and every backpack that I ever take into the backcountry. Specifically, my favorite blade of theirs is the Speedgoat. It's lightweight, but so incredibly capable, I never leave home without it. If you're familiar with Montana Knife Company, you know it is often very difficult to get one of their blades because they sell out within minutes of being released. What you should be able to find in stock are the Blackfoot 2.0, Speedgoat, or a Stonewall Skinner. And if you use the code CHANGEAGENTS10, that's going to net you 10% off of your first order. Again, my personal favorite blade is the Speedgoat. If they have them in stock right now, don't mess around. Put it in your cart and complete the checkout. Montana Knife Company, they build working knives for working people. And like I said at the beginning, I could not be more proud to collaborate with them on Change Agents Season 2. Even though I know the answer to the next question is going to be based on what the Eritrean government is saying, which already in our conversation I feel like probably shouldn't be trusted. How do they speak about their own prison system? Is it even a topic that they're willing to address?
So they did not respond to requests for comment on my article. They have routinely denied being involved in any human rights abuses, including in Tigray, and they spent 5 months denying that their troops were even in Tigray, contrary to, dozens of witness testimonies and evidence. The Eritrean government doesn't really answer very many questions.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it does, but generally their response is that what we do is our business, and we do not commit abuses.
Yeah, it's kind of a boilerplate response for a lot of areas that are doing exactly the opposite of what they're publicly saying. So you're not going to get any information from the Eritrean government. How hard was it for you to start to piece this together and finding people who were willing to talk? It sounds like there's a level of, I guess I would use the word censorship when it comes to the Eritrean government when talking about their prison system. Was it a difficult subject for you to actually develop research and intelligence on, or were people pretty forthright and willing to come forward?
The people who are willing to speak most openly are mostly those who have managed to reach a Western country some time ago. But by and large, people were very reluctant to speak, very reluctant to be named. Only 2 of them said that I could use their names. People who had left most recently were absolutely terrified. They fear for the safety of their family members back in Eritrea. They fear that they might be deported to Eritrea or sent back. I interviewed some people that had managed to escape and then had been captured and sent back. There was these thousands of refugees that were forced to return from Ethiopia. People have been forced back from Sudan. There's terrible people smuggling rings in the Sahel, where I think I'll have to look up the exact number of people, but certainly tens of thousands. I think it might be about 200,000 Eritreans trying to escape have been captured by people smugglers and are trafficked for their organs. They are kept in sort of makeshift prisons and tortured, and videos of that torture is sent to their relatives abroad in order to extract ransoms from them. Some of them have been forced to join Islamic State as fighters. So the fact that people are willing to risk terrible torture and death to escape from their homeland is, I think, pretty revealing of the state of affairs there.
Yeah. Looking at the risks in front of them, obviously the motivation behind them has to be something that is pretty robust for them to kind of walk through that wall of fire. How common are the reports of torture, and what kind of torture is the Eritrean government resorting to?
So most of the accounts, and not everybody that I spoke to was tortured, by the way. Although if you count, say, being put in an underground cell that's so suffocating that people start dying as torture,
I'm going to count that as torture.
Yeah, that could go up. Some people were beaten. Some people spent months in tiny little dark cells that were so small that you could neither lie down nor stand up. Some people would be tied in what they call the helicopter position, with your hands behind your back, and then tied to your ankles, and beaten or left outside in the cold so that your joints kind of freeze up. One of the men that I'd interviewed, who spent months in one of those tiny little cells, said that because he was quite close to the interrogation rooms, he could hear when people were being beaten. Everybody could hear the screaming. He said people would call for their mothers most of the time. People would beg to live, beg not to die. And he said that just, the sounds were so awful that the prisoners would they didn't dare to say anything, but they would just thump on the bottom of the wall like this, just to kind of say to each other, I'm here, I'm alive, I'm still here, I'm with you, just so that you could hear a sound from another human. And that was the best they could do. That was all they could do to reassure each other, knowing that one day soon it was going to be them screaming as well, and everybody else listening.
It's eerily similar to the knocking and Morse code taps that American servicemen in Vietnam, like in the Hanoi Hilton, the ways that they would communicate just to let each other know that they were not alone, or very basic communications. And again, an environment where torture was certainly on the menu every day.
I think if you're desperately afraid, you just want to know that there's another human close by that's maybe a little bit sympathetic.
Yeah. What is Eritrea known for? I feel like this particular president is probably not holding this all together. I feel like there might be some international influence from other countries helping out here.
Well, it's very diplomatically aligned with Russia. It was the only African nation to vote with Russia at the UN, against this resolution condemning the invasion of Ukraine. So it receives a lot of diplomatic support from Russia. The president, there's a lot of visits between the foreign ministers, visiting each other's capitals. I think the foreign minister also visited Crimea. I'll have to check on that. Just after the fighting broke out in Crimea, and then it has substantial mining interests that until a few years ago, actually a Canadian company was working there, but they were facing so many lawsuits about the use of slave labor. They exited, and Chinese companies took over the mining there, which is potash. There's some silver and some other minerals. But I mean, it is a desperately poor country, but it is very clear about, it would like the Russians to build a military base there on the Red Sea. And it's very clear that it considers, let's say, like Western powers as people who are unnecessarily antagonizing Eritrea.
Yeah. Looking at not a stat, but a piece of information in front of me. It says there's very limited internet in the country, and cell phones are monitored. And that is, 20 years ago, that would be very cutting edge technology. I wouldn't say that it's necessarily cutting edge in the modern day, but it's also not an infrastructure that a very poor country would likely have the ability to do on their own. Who do you think that they're getting this surveillance technology from? I know you mentioned China and Russia. Do you think that they're working in tandem with them to keep a closer eye on their own population?
So I wouldn't like to speculate on that, but I can say that SIM cards are very restricted. You need permission from several officials to buy one. We don't do any interviews with people inside the country because contact with a foreign journalist could result in immediate arrest, even if they would speak to us, which I've never met anybody who said, yes, we'd be willing to speak to a foreign journalist in the country. The risks are just too high for them. So how they're doing it exactly, I don't know. I know diplomats are restricted from leaving the capital. There is no free press. Information is very tightly controlled, and so are phone lines and internet access. I mean, I think it's very few people that actually have access to the internet there.
Yeah. Again, the more you tell me about this country, the more it aligns with the North Korea of the African continent for sure. And I'm yet to, in my life, encounter a situation where the restriction of information and the gatekeeping of information has actually been for the greater good. Maybe one day we'll find a situation. It's like, oh, it was for everybody's benefit. So far, it has been for the exact opposite of that. And it sounds like this might be the case in Eritrea as well. 42 people you were able to talk to. What was the most challenging story that you heard in those 42?
Oh, I heard so many heartbreaking stories, but one of them, quite early on in my interviews, I was speaking to somebody about a prison that they had been in, and they were describing one of their cellmates who was a popular footballer in his Asmara neighborhood. He was left-handed. He was an artist. He used to do little thumbnail sketches of people in the prison to kind of keep their spirits up. And he was eventually executed for trying to help people forge papers to leave the country. And as this interview was being translated to me, what I do is I use a system that doesn't allow the translator to see the interviewee or the interviewee to see the phone number of the translator. So separate devices for everybody's security. But my interviewer sent me a message on WhatsApp, and he said, I know this guy. And it was a close relative of his. And when he spoke again, he was doing his translation, he was doing his job, but I could hear that pain in his voice because this was somebody that he had loved, and now he was telling a story.
It's heartbreaking.
Yeah, there are many, many stories like that. Everybody knows someone. One of my interviewees said to me, you know how you Americans talk about where you went to college when you meet each other? If you're Eritrean, you talk about what prison you were in. It's that common.
Do you have any estimate as to what percentage of the population in Eritrea finds their way into prison?
Nobody's even really sure what exactly the population of Eritrea is.
Is there an estimate?
So there's quite differing estimates. The estimate that we went with was 3.7 million. I think that was from the World Bank. But if you don't know how many people there are, it's kind of hard to say how many of them have ended up in prison. Honestly, I just couldn't tell you. But with the numbers of the people, I think it's something like a fifth of the population has tried to flee the country, or has fled the country. And once you account for old people and young people and people who are in the military, that accounts for quite probably a significant chunk of the population, if not the majority of it.
Yeah. No, the stat I have in front of me says up to 15% of the country's population has fled. I mean, that's
a lot.
Yeah. Well, even that, if Ethiopia is sending people back, and then on the western border, you have Sudan, southern border, southeastern border, you have Djibouti, and then Somalia. I guess you could well, I wouldn't recommend it. You could swim through the Red Sea and find your way over to Yemen and Saudi Arabia. I'm assuming they need to go farther than that. Is there a location or a country in the world where the majority of these people are able to put their roots back in and find a home, or is it kind of just all over the place, wherever they can put their roots down?
It's all over the world. It's wherever they can get to. Ethiopia was a huge destination. Sudan was a huge destination before the war broke out. You have many Eritrean refugees trapped in this fighting because if they go home, then they risk being put in prison. They might not be able to make it through the front lines of the Sudanese civil war. Many of them are very, very poor. You have diaspora populations in many countries, but you have a huge diaspora population in the United States, actually.
Is there a certain area where they have co-located?
There's quite a lot spread out through the U.S. There's quite a lot in Washington, but there's in many cities, actually, you have Eritreans. But again, people, generally speaking, don't really like to speak out because if you criticize the government publicly, I certainly know journalists that have been attacked in London. There was somebody just convicted for his second attack on a journalist.
Specifically reporting on Eritrea?
Yes, the journalists were reporting on Eritrea. One journalist was Eritrean and one was British.
Wow.
And there's all sorts of, online kind of hate that can come for you. I've seen a lot of threats sent to people, threats against them, threats against their families. If you travel back to Eritrea, you can be arrested. If you have property in Eritrea, it can be seized. If you have relatives in Eritrea, they can face retribution. So if you have left Eritrea without permission and you want to go back to visit family for any reason, for example, you have to sign a sheet of paper in the embassy saying that you have committed a crime and will submit to whatever punishment the state deems fit.
Okay. That seems like a very double-edged sword. What is day-to-day life like in Eritrea? I mean, I'm sure it depends based on where you're at. I mean, there's the prison aspect, again, either overt or covert. But for those who have not touched or engaged in that prison system, what is life like for day-to-day in Eritrea?
I think for the majority of the population, it's a struggle. It's, like I said, a very poor country. I interviewed one teenager who had spent nearly 2 years mostly hiding in his family's one-room home to try to avoid forced conscription. But there are some, especially in the capital, especially the children of higher-ranking officials that enjoy privileges. Some of them are diaspora that maybe have been sent back by their parents if they got into trouble abroad. I think those people do have quite a lot of access to the internet and knowledge about what goes on abroad. But that's certainly not the experience of the majority of the population.
Yeah. The forced conscription, it sounds like, or it seems like, you may not know what is going to be done with you, meaning the jobs that you will be forced to do seem very diverse. Do you have an idea or understanding of the types of things that they are I was going to say asked, but I don't know if that's the right word for it, are conscripted to do?
So the vast majority do go into the military.
Okay.
And that's referred to as Sawa. There's a training camp. They're separated, boys, girls, separated into different units. There's a big prison there as well. If you try to escape from Sawa, beatings again are quite common. Food is terrible. You're not sure when you might see your family again. But the majority of people do go into the prisons. Some people don't. If you don't go into the prisons, you would need to get good grades. You might be able to study as an engineer or something like this, but then you still have to give your service to the state.
Has there been, in the 30 years that the president has been in power, has there even been a legitimate, I don't want to use the word threat, but challenge to his position, or has he held a steadfast grip of control over the country ever since he was put into power?
So there was a group of ministers who urged pro-democracy reforms in an open letter. That was, I think that was about slightly more than 20 years ago. They're known as the G15. So they signed a letter saying it would be good to have, elections, the constitution, the rule of law. All of them were put in prison and none of them have been heard from since. There was rumors of a coup attempt in 2013. I have heard of other rumors, but it's very difficult to confirm information there because, even the diplomats who are stationed there often can't really tell you what's going on because they themselves have got so many restrictions. And I think there's certainly widespread disenchantment with the leadership of Isaias. I believe there are several people within the government that feel that way, but whether they are going to take any action on that, I'm not sure. There's certainly a rapidly growing protest movement outside of the country, and that's why we're seeing a lot of violent clashes at Eritrean cultural festivals, because you see protesters against the government showing up to confront supporters of the government. And that's why we've seen, running battles in Israel, in Oslo, in Montreal, in Australia recently. You have seen in the last couple of years lots of street fights between this growing, more militant opposition who really want to challenge the president, and people who don't speak out against the government, people who are content to, or who are just afraid to speak out against the government. It might not be that they support them, but it might also be fear. They do have some support.
Yeah. I have a stat in front of me here. It says, in a recent global report from the United Nations Refugee Agency, or UNHCR, Eritrea ranked among the top 10 countries of origin for refugees worldwide. Why is it, or why do you think that most people today don't know about the refugee and humanitarian crisis happening there?
It doesn't present an existential threat to Western nations. And there are other crises that do, so we pay more attention to it. It's a small country. A very large proportion of people want to leave it. But by nature, many of the people who do leave it are extremely secretive because they are afraid. It's very much a culture of secrecy and not speaking out, because the wrong word can always get you or your family put into prison. So many people just don't talk about what they've been through. Many people are deeply traumatized as well. After my article came out, I had outreach from a couple of, one was a doctor, one was a psychiatrist who worked with torture victims in Eritrea. And they said, oh yeah, like we really recognized a lot of the things that you described. We've been working with people who've been so traumatized, it's taken them years to open up about what happened to them. The gentleman in Los Angeles, Woolley, the nurse, said he thinks that most of the people that have escaped have got PTSD, but they don't have the vocabulary to describe it or the knowledge on how to deal with it.
I would agree with you on the lack of an existential threat, so therefore people don't pay direct attention to that. And, I think the hardest question, other than human beings are being abused, the hardest question to answer, I think, for people would be, well, why should I care? And I'm curious what your answer to that is. Say somebody in the United States living in California, living their best life, cruising up and down Santa Monica Boulevard. And I have no idea why I just chose Santa Monica Boulevard. It's not something I have a lot of experience with. Why should they care?
So, first of all, let me just say, sometimes we all need afternoons cruising up and down Santa Monica Boulevard. But we also need to be aware of what's going on in our world, and what's happening to our brothers and sisters around it. I think if we ignore the suffering of these people and we allow them to come out in their tens of thousands and their hundreds of thousands and drown in the Mediterranean, have their kidneys cut out, be raped on camera, and have videos sent to their brother to try and squeeze another $20,000 out of them, and videos on my phone of young girls being tortured that people have sent to me, if we ignore that, are we really human? Doesn't our empathy make us human? You remember in, I think it was Blade Runner, when the test for the difference between a human and a robot was being able to walk by a tortoise on its back, and the human would stop and turn it over because we feel sorry for the tortoise. Isn't our ability to feel the pain of other people part of our humanity?
In your experience, where would be better directions for people to look for information? And perhaps the term better isn't, I'm trying to find a term that is kind of down the middle of the road, as opposed to trying to push you towards any boundaries that you might bump up against. What would you recommend for people who want to learn more specifically about Eritrea or things in that area? What resources would you point people towards?
So I would point people towards, there's been a lot of reports by International Human Rights Watch on the human rights issues there. There's a lot of reports by the Department of State. There are several opposition news outlets that cover Eritrea. There is a scarcity of reporting on the subject in the Western media. That is true, because it's very difficult to get into that country. Mm-hmm. They don't give visas easily. And once you get in there, surveillance is extremely tight. So anybody that you speak to is very aware that what they say might land them in trouble at any time. Where else could you get reporting? There was quite a bit of reporting on what Eritrean troops did during the war in Ethiopia. I produced quite a lot of those reports myself as the Register Bureau Chief at that time, with an excellent team, with my colleagues. So I would probably start in those places. Those would be good places to get some more information.
Okay.
And talk to an Eritrean that you know. They're actually all around in the States. Start a conversation with them. A lot of them have got stories that would make escape from Alcatraz seem like a walk in the park. You might be surprised by what you hear.
Yeah. Do you think it's a solvable problem?
I do think it's a solvable problem. I think all problems eventually are solvable problems. The question is just how many people will have to suffer and die before the problem is solved.
Yeah, that's a fair statement. What would you want to leave people with?
I would like to leave people. So many people discuss migration and refugees as a problem that needs to be solved, as people who need to be kept out, as people who are a threat. And I would like you to know that many of these people who have made heroic journeys to flee Eritrea, who have braved people traffickers, who have braved underground prisons, who may have made 4 or 5 attempts to escape before they finally got out, who have brothers and sisters at the bottom of the Mediterranean. They're worth listening to. They have an, incredible inner strength and kindness, and that their story should be heard. And what they say is valuable, and that they are valuable members of society, and that these are not people that should be scorned or looked down on. But many of them are heroes and heroines, and they should be listened to.
Hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you would like to learn more about this issue and potentially how you can help, please visit the Human Rights Watch, which is hotelromeowhiskey.org, HRW.org, and Amnesty International, amnestyusa.org, amnestyusa.org. Thank you again for listening to Change Agents, an Ironclad original presented by Montana Knife Company. We're going to be back next week with an all-new guest. See you guys then. Today's episode of Change Agents is brought to you by the Navy SEAL Foundation. And they are special to me for obvious reasons. I have a genetic tie to them through my time in service, and I've actually worked with them on a variety of fundraising and charitable initiatives. Their entire mission is to provide critical support for warriors, veterans, and families of naval special warfare. Fundraising is really hard. It's hard to ask people for money, especially if you are asking them for a check with nothing in return. I wish I could say it would be as easy as pulling on somebody's heartstrings and they reach into their wallet and they give what they can. But oftentimes, people are hesitant to give unless they can see the tangible results of the money or they get something in return. So I'm about to offer you that opportunity. The Navy SEAL Foundation has just launched their winter apparel line, and they have everything that you need to stay warm because we're in the winter. So what better than supporting a charity, but also getting something to keep you warm in return. So you can step up your style while you're showing your support. Each purchase directly contributes to honoring naval special warfare and their families. You can visit shop.navysealfoundation.org to grab your gear now.